Thank you for joining me on TBR today, and we are in conversation with Kenneth Roth, the former Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, on his latest book, Righting Wrongs. Ken, thank you for speaking with us.
Great to be with you, Nazia.
You have been fighting for 3 decades abusive governments all over the world. But tell me something, very honestly. Were you as good and diligent a note taker as you were a fighter? Because this book is delightfully detailed.
Well, I actually never kept a diary. In retrospect, I really wish I had. But whenever I would have a meeting with the government, first of all, there were preparatory materials I have, which were often in writing. There would be notes afterwards that were in writing. And I did have access to all my electronic files. So I went back through that. I had my own recollection. I was very much helped by the Human Rights Watch staff because I wouldn't do heads of state meetings by myself. I would always be with somebody. So they would have their recollections too. Often I would write articles at the time after a meeting. So I had a lot to draw on. And I knew that this book couldn't be about abstract points. It had to tell stories. And so I was able to find enough stories to make it compelling.
I must say, very, very compelling stories, and we will get to them in a bit. But you've started the book quoting Martin Luther King Jr., saying his famous lines, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." But were there not moments when you questioned your long and seemingly never-ending fight?
Well, first, I should say I quote Martin Luther King because I don't agree with that quote. And to be honest, he didn't either, because if you read to later in the speech, he says, no, it actually doesn't bend toward justice by itself. You've got to fight for justice. And that's the real point of the book, is that the defense of human rights is an incessant struggle because governments always have their reasons to violate human rights. It's a way to stay in power. It's a way to silence the opposition. So our job in the human rights movement is to fight back, to raise the cost of human rights violations, to tilt the cost-benefit calculation behind repression. And so if you don't accept that that's a perpetual fight, you shouldn't be in the business. You don't get permanent wins. You get some victories, but you can get setbacks. But it's the struggle that matters, because by continuing to push back, we make it harder for governments to violate human rights.
Well said. But there seems to be a lot of noise nowadays around questioning, around not questioning democratically elected governments. How they're making a case for they're supposedly representing what people want. Can you walk us through why and how that logic is completely flawed?
Well, first, the idea that democracies don't violate human rights, it's crazy. When people used to say that to me, I would say, I can answer you in 2 words, George Bush. And I would point to his torture. I would point to Guantanamo. Today I would say Donald Trump, I suppose. It's the same answer. Being a democracy is a good way to ensure the government is accountable. It's not a guarantee against human rights violations. And, India shows that, Brazil showed that under Bolsonaro, Trump shows that today in the United States. So you've got to work on everyone. And I believe that human rights principles are not just limited to the global South. They're not just limited to autocracies. They really apply to every government.
That brings me to the next question, that you mention a very close scrutiny of your work around Israel right from the start, to the extent that you felt that work could not go out without your explicit approval. What makes the work around Israel so particularly contested a topic right from the beginning?
Well, I should note, I did look at many, many reports in many different countries, but as I said in the book, with Israel and Palestine, I reviewed everything we put out. And I did that because I knew it would be criticized. Israel has these, this vast network of people who defend anything it does. And they are going to attack us whenever we criticize them. So I wanted to make sure that we were right. I didn't want to say, I wouldn't have said it that way. So I just made sure that I was completely comfortable with the reports, that they were factually accurate, that they were principled. I would often strengthen them, and then they went out. And then I could defend them, wholeheartedly, because I knew they were right. And indeed, we welcomed the attacks because we won the battle over facts. When Human Rights Watch put out our report on apartheid, which was this incredibly detailed 200-plus page report, the Israeli government didn't know what to say. The facts were right, the legal analysis was right. So its supporters resorted to the usual name calling. You're biased, you're anti-Semitic. We figured that's a victory. If that's the best they can say, then we actually are onto something here. We're appropriately calling the oppressive occupation in the occupied territories apartheid.
And such name calling doesn't bother you?
Oh, it's just part of the practice of defending human rights. I should say that being charged as being anti-Semitic is particularly rich because, I'm Jewish. My father fled the Nazis as a young boy. I entered this field to try to prevent the kind of atrocities that I grew up hearing about from my father. So, it's just a joke. But the use of anti-Semitism to try to silence criticism of Israel actually undermines anti-Semitism as an important concept, because Jews around the world are threatened by anti-Semitism today. But if people come to believe that charges of anti-Semitism are just an excuse to protect Israel, it cheapens the concept at a point when we need a strong defense against anti-Semitism to try to stop it.
But this argument is being used in different contexts, not just in Israel's context, but across the world. We see Eastern governments saying human rights is a Western construct. The Western governments coming back and questioning the legitimacy of the international human rights laws, the International Criminal Code. Do you think there's something changing in the way we need to understand and engage with the world right now? Do you think there's
Well, there are a lot of questions there, so let me try to separate them. First, the idea that human rights are a Western construct is ridiculous. I've traveled around the world. I've never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed. I've never met somebody who wants to be tortured, who wants to be imprisoned based on their beliefs or their expression, or have an unfair trial, or be deprived of education or housing or healthcare. So these are universal desires. Some people don't want them for their enemies, but they always want them for themselves. And the people who say that these are Western impositions are the dictators. They're the autocrats who are looking for an excuse to fend off criticism of their repression. It's not the people who are the victims of their repression. So, we should see through that excuse very quickly. Now, is the human rights cause in trouble today? People often ask this in terms of kind of the global context between autocracy and democracy. And the common wisdom is, autocracy is ascendant, democracy is in decline. I think that that's actually simplistic. If you look, particularly in the global South, people who live under autocrats don't want it. They keep coming to the streets in these mass protests for democracy. In Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Iran, Russia, Belarus, Uganda. I could just keep going. They don't always win. In Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they got rid of the tyrants. Other times, the tyrants use repression to cling to power. But people make clear what they want. The real problem here is, ironically, in the established democracies in the West, where there is a group of people who feel left behind, who feel that government is not serving them, that they're not heard, they're not respected. And these are the people who become ripe for the autocratic appeal. And so I think the challenge for the human rights movement is, first to press governments to respond to everybody, not just the people who are part of, the more elite global economy, but everyone. But second, we have to really respond to the autocratic efforts to change the subject from their misgovernance and demonize certain disfavored minorities. It's always the immigrants or it's the gays. There's certain kind of usual scapegoats. And our job is to show the shallowness of that effort and to build a community in which everybody gets the rights that they deserve. One of the main points of the book is that whether you have a government or a university or a corporation or any institution where there are public expectations for how it should behave, that gives you power. Because if the leaders of that institution fall short of those expectations, you can use the same shaming tools that I outline in the book to push them, to generate real pressure on them to behave better. And that's something, I describe this applying to governments, but it can apply to any institution of power if it falls short of what it should be doing. Now, the other thing people often ask me, well, what can I do as a single individual? These are vast issues. But the process of shaming requires reflecting a government's conduct off the public sense of right and wrong. If we spotlight what a government does, and if people say, whatever, you don't shame them. You don't get to move them. So we need a strong sense of right and wrong among the public. And how do you do that? Well, in today's world, people trust their friends, their family, their acquaintances at work, more than distant pundits or distant media institutions. And so when you're, at the coffee machine, when you're on social media, when you're talking at the dinner table, talk about these things, help build that sense of right and wrong, because that is the foundation that the human rights movement needs to hold governments to account.
Is that where the name of the book comes from?
Yes, that's what it's about. It's not about just, human rights in the legal sense. It's about righting any wrong that's out there.
In an increasingly performative world that's battling polycrisis right now, at any given point actually, does shaming as a tool work anymore? Aren't we like in a post-truth, post-shame world where we are actually shaming criminals among more criminals?
People have been saying forever that shaming doesn't work. And it is true that certain people are so abusive that it's much more difficult to shame them. Bashar al-Assad of Syria was like that. He was dropping chemical weapons on his people. He was dropping barrel bombs. He was, massively torturing, disappearing, and executing people. So it was harder, although not impossible, to shame him. Putin is becoming that way now in Ukraine. But most governments at least pretend to respect human rights because it's a way of telling the people of their country, I'm looking out for you, not just myself. And so if the human rights movement can shine a spotlight on the discrepancy between this pretense and the more ugly practice, it's embarrassing. It's shameful, it's delegitimizing, and governments go to great lengths to avoid it. And just to give you one example, if there's anybody you'd think would be indifferent to this, it would be Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader. Because here's this massive country, they violate human rights left and right at home. But when the human rights movement tried to put China's treatment of the Uyghurs on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council, an effort where we failed by 2 votes, so it was very close, Xi Jinping himself was calling up heads of state, pressing them to vote with China. You don't do that if you don't care about being shamed. So it just shows the ongoing power of our ability as a movement to embarrass governments by their misconduct.
But do you think the human rights space has a weaker platform now to talk about rights and to fight for public opinion, considering that governments and their big rich tech giant friends have the mic and the platform now? We don't.
Well, yes, governments have a microphone, but truth really matters. And even on social media where, I'm as infuriated as the next that, Elon Musk's ridiculous musings show up at the top of my X feed, nonetheless, many people seek out the truth, and they can find it by going to respected sources. And you go to groups like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, you go to newspapers like the New York Times or the Guardian. If that were not the case, you would see governments simply using propaganda. But they don't do that. They also use censorship. And why is the Chinese government spending so much on the Great Firewall? Why is Putin trying to shut down independent voices? Because they know the truth matters. They know the truth is dangerous for them because it shows how they're serving themselves and not their people. So we still have power because the human rights movement can reveal the truth. And governments know that. You can tell it by their own conduct.
So you have been sanctioned by Kremlin, the hotbed of crackdown of civil society, can we call it? Do you think that's where it all started from Russia in 2012 by bringing in their Foreign Agents Act? In 2015, they got a law that enabled banning undesirable foreign organizations, killing journalists, dissenters, and of course, post-Ukraine, the entire country has been inaccessible. But do you think they laid the groundwork for the rest of the world and the copycat nations around the world to crack down and clamp down on civil society as a whole?
Russia has been one model for shutting down civil society, and it really began largely after Putin had stepped down from the presidency because he was term limited. He switched with Medvedev, and was prime minister for a while. And he then came back with an election that was broadly viewed as having been stolen. There were protests. He was terrified that Russia would be the next color revolution, and he began to crack down. And this has only gotten worse when he invaded Ukraine, thinking it would be a cakewalk. It was a disaster, lots of opposition, and he's now tried to quash that as well. So, yes, Putin has been legally clever in coming up with various excuses to shut down independent voices, but lots of other governments do this too. And we should recognize that Russia was starting from a point after the fall of the Soviet Union where there actually was a degree of pluralism within Russia. In China, there isn't that. I mean, it was never nearly as open as Russia was after the fall of communist rule. So, I view Russia as a model, but not the exclusive model. And I think we see autocrats in a variety of countries developing their own models. Viktor Orban is, or the Turkish President Erdogan have developed their own capacity to try to chip away at the checks and balances on executive power, which is, different from these more overtly repressive countries. They try to maintain a facade of electoral rule, but tilt the playing field enough so they always win. So there are different variations on this theme, and we have to be aware of that.
Do you think arts has a role in defending human rights?
I mean, autocrats hate artists because artists, almost by definition, are independent thinkers. And autocrats don't want independent thought. And that's why you often see artists among the first to be persecuted. Indeed, I open up the book with one of my earliest investigations, which was in the former Czechoslovakia. And I went to observe the trial of something known as the Jazz Section, which was an independent journal actually authorized by the Communist Party at the time that was supposed to write about jazz. And they thought, what could go wrong there? And it ended up writing about this very vibrant underground cultural scene in Prague, was hugely read, and the government couldn't tolerate it. So they prosecuted the editor and the writers. And, at the time when I was observing the trial, I couldn't quite see where it was going. This was in 1987. But it ended up foretelling the fall of communism 2 years later, because it showed this brittle regime that was trying to prevent people from thinking for themselves. And that's really hard to do. And the artists, as so often happens, were at the forefront, but very quickly society followed.
I was very intrigued by the book cover. Can you tell us how you decided on that?
Yes. Well, okay. I should show this, I guess. But no, this, it's an artist who did this. It's not actually a photograph. The first photograph that my publisher showed me, the first drawing, was completely bleak and depressing. And I said, that's not what the book is about. Yes, I deal with horrible things, but I deal with how you make them better. And so this is supposed to be, a nondescript any urban environment, but it's supposed to be lighter and more hopeful because it is a hopeful book. It shows how we can collectively make things better. And that's what I want the message to be.
Why is hope so important to you?
Well, I don't believe in naive hope. I'm not this Pollyannish type, the world's going to be better. I believe that if you fight, you can make it better. And so I believe in the fight. I've devoted my life to this. I see how we've gotten stuff done. I think it can continue. I hope that my book helps, secure an ongoing movement that continues to pursue the work that I did as demonstrated in this book.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, Ken, today, and for your time and for this amazing book that I'm sure will be taken up by all our readers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.